like to start off here with a song that I recorded here not long ago. I think it's one of the prettiest ones I've ever recorded. Boys, if you will, a little tune called The Lost Highway. I'm a rolling stone, all alone and lost, for a life of sin I have paid the cost. When I pass by, all the people say, there goes another boy down the lost highway.
For more than a century, the flow of energy has quietly decided who holds power and who does not. When coal powered the rise of industrial nations, workers discovered they could stop entire economies by interrupting that flow. Mines, railways, and factories became choke points where ordinary people could force concessions from governments and owners. Strikes and sabotage translated into real political leverage. Then, the world switched to oil. Oil moved differently, through pipelines and tankers with far less human labor. It was designed to keep flowing even when workers pushed back. The same fuel that drove cars and factories also reshaped politics, insulating capital from the kinds of democratic claims coal had once made possible. Control over distant oil fields, pricing systems, and supply lines became tools of dominance. Today, that story is changing again. Choke points, once used to maintain order, are now being turned the other way. Price shocks and supply disruptions are accelerating a shift towards new forms of energy. The technical properties of what we burn have always shaped the kinds of politics we can have. What happens when the old rules no longer hold?
The transition from coal to oil significantly reshaped mass politics by eliminating opportunities to sabotage the flow of capital, an ability essential to democracy. In the age of coal, human interaction was necessary for obtaining and transporting the flow of energy.
So you need linemen setting up the lines for getting electricity to the place. You need the truck drivers. You need train drivers, and all sort of. There's a heavy sort of labor concentration for coal production, which creates the opportunity to build bonds among different working classes to actually giving them an ability to stop the production in a more effective way. So if the boss says do this, do the X, Y, Z, work 12 hours, work 18-hour shifts, and people have a right to resist. Coal, in this case, change the nature of capitalism, the productive output of capitalism.
The ability to stop the flow of capital enables workers to make democratic claims to their bosses through strikes, unionizations, or sabotage. Come 1902, a coal strike by the United Mine Workers of America caused a 5-month disruption in the supply chain and left thousands of Americans without the fuel necessary to live. This strike posed such a threat that President Theodore Roosevelt intervened and facilitated bargaining sessions that resulted in the meeting of the miners' demands. Oil quickly replaced coal as the default source of energy because of its superior energy density, the ability to transport through pipelines, and perceived abundance. Whereas coal mining relied on workers traveling down into the mines to extract coal, oil production was designed to minimize human interaction and thus the ability to make democratic claims.
Once you tap an oil well, it is not nearly as labor intensive as going into the coal mines and digging through the coal itself. That puts a limit on working class's ability to interrupt the production process.
The global necessity for oil was stimulated by the needs of the British Royal Navy. In 1912, Winston Churchill, then Chief of the Admiralty, mandated the transition from coal-powered to oil-powered ships for a faster and more efficient fleet. However, Britain's lack of domestic oil meant the nation's security depended on a resource it did not have. To mitigate this risk, the British government bought a 51% stake in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, solidifying its presence in the Middle East and marking the emergence of oil as necessary to national security. This move brought the Middle East into the conversation and gave Iran global economic relevance. By leveraging the concession system's long-term land grants, foreign oil companies engaged in strategic land grabbing. They claimed massive plots of land with no intention of drilling, effectively landlocking resources to quell competition. Exploiting Iran's oil reserves in this way created oil monopolies with the power to spike crude oil prices without consulting the producing countries.
In March of 1951, Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, with the support of Iran's parliament, nationalized Iran's oil industry, taking control of the British Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in order to reclaim economic sovereignty. The oil industry was denationalized under the Consortium Agreement of 1954. The agreement divided up Iran's oil shares among the major Western oil companies.
Right. The 53 coup, the British-US-backed organized coup, was a profoundly important point in Middle East politics in that period and sort of served as a warning to other states that were interested in taking direct control on oil resources.
The oil industry was denationalized under the Consortium Agreement of 1954. The agreement divided up Iran's oil shares among the major Western oil companies. The coup, restoration of the Shah, and Consortium Agreement began decades of repression and anti-Western sentiment that would have long-term geopolitical consequences within Iran and continue to shape tensions in the region today. Despite the risk of nationalization, as demonstrated by the 1953 coup in Iran, on July 26, 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal through the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company, a joint British-French enterprise that had been operating the waterway since its construction.
Egypt didn't have significant amounts of oil, but in some ways the Suez Canal was seen as something equivalent, a source of very important revenues to the state. And that was sort of seen in parallel because the response, again, of Britain, but this time working with France and with Israel, was to invade Egypt and try and overthrow the government of Nasser.
The United States condemned the invasion. Eisenhower threatened economic sanctions against Britain, and the UN demanded a ceasefire. The conflict ended after about a week, with the Suez remaining in Egyptian control. Dr. Timothy Mitchel argues that the Iranian coup and the Suez Canal crisis relate to a larger issue.
So the two sort of worked together and were taken in the region as a whole as a warning about the threats to attempts at oil nationalization, which is part of the reason why oil nationalization really took the best part of another 2 decades.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. There will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities.
Iran and Egypt served as an example to the Western powers of the risk that nationalization posed. The weakness inherent in overt foreign interference in Middle Eastern politics has been exposed. Alongside raw force, another method of imperialism was engineered: economic warfare. In October of 1973, the Yom Kippur War began between Israel, Egypt, and Syria. To counter the Soviet Union's influence in the Middle East, the United States aided Israel with arms support. In response, the Arab forces of OPEC restricted oil production, cutting shipments to the United States by 5%, with a promise to cut 5% more every month until a resolution was reached. The United States' unwavering support of Israel marked the beginning of a long-term alliance between the two countries. Saudi Arabia's embargo signified the first time that oil was used as a political weapon on a global scale, serving as a catalyst for conflicts to come. The 1970s oil crisis that followed is often thought to be the result of the Arab oil embargo, yet experts argue otherwise.
You have this artificial crisis created because they just decide to, as a political reaction, stop production of oil.
By 1974, oil prices in the United States had quadrupled.
By the end of this month, more than 2 million barrels a day of oil we expected to import into the United States will no longer be available. We must therefore face up to a very stark fact. We are heading toward the most acute shortages of energy since World War II. Our supply of petroleum this winter will be at least...
Talks of an energy crisis began as early as the 1960s, as OPEC began to take control of the production of oil. Oil companies raised prices by as much as 50%, passing the cost of the increased producer countries' income onto American consumers. As oil prices began to rise, companies feared that consumers might rely on other forms of energy, such as natural gas, nuclear, or even coal. With the help of the Nixon administration, American oil companies aimed to monopolize energy production and increase the prices of competing energy sources. By the late 1960s, 24 U.S. oil companies produced 3/4 of the country's natural gas. The oil companies now became energy companies. The crisis was no longer an oil crisis, but rather an energy crisis. The companies began pushing for an increase in the price of other energy sources, primarily natural gas, so that oil prices could rise without consequence. When their requests for rate increases were denied, the companies announced the supply of natural gas was dwindling. Manufacturing scarcity allowed the oil companies to maintain oil demand, even as prices rose.
Artificial scarcity, which is not necessarily limited to oil. Artificial scarcity is everywhere, like even in fast food chains.
The 1970s energy crisis had little to do with the Arab weapon and everything to do with the oil companies' need to maintain control over resources and power. In the aftermath of World War II, the era of traditional imperialism drew to a close. In many ways, including monetarily, the Western world was in shambles. In July of 1944, delegates from 44 nations met at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their goal was to establish a stable post-war international monetary system in hopes of preventing further conflicts and depressions. The Bretton Woods Agreement established the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and linked all currencies to the US dollar, which would become the only currency backed by gold. However, by 1971, the United States gold reserves began to dwindle. Facing immense war debts and unsustainable global demand for gold in exchange for dollars, US President Richard Nixon ended the Bretton Woods Agreement, taking the US off the gold standard.
That kind of breaks the limits, the physical limits of any country to create currency. But then you face the problem of inflation.
However, just 3 years later, in a secret meeting with Saudi Arabian government, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger struck an agreement. In exchange for weapons, Saudi Arabia would price all Saudi oil in dollars. The United States economy, no longer stabilized by gold, was now propped up by oil, ushering in the era of the petrodollar and restructuring the world economy.
In the post-1950s period, after US makes the arrangements with Saudi Arabia, it becomes in the interest of both of those governments, Saudi Arabia and United States, to peg the buying and selling of oil in dollar reserves. Petrodollar refers to that scheme. So you can buy and sell oil, and the currency that you buy and sell oil is US dollars, which imposes a global necessity on stable dollar. The matching of oil exchange, not production, with US dollar as the currency for that exchange matches also the reality of the necessity of oil with the created necessity for dollars. So that all of a sudden connects Saudi oil production with the stability and consistent artificial need for US dollars. That pegging is then furthered by US insistence on selling weapons to the Saudi government. The petrodollars that is accumulated through that are then made available to less developed nations for loan through World Bank, IMF.
Shah has gone up in flames. He's been driven from his country, in all likelihood, never to return.
Khomeini, an exiled religious scholar highly critical of the Shah, had gained significant influence among Iranians, particularly among the religious youth. Thousands of Iranians would follow, protesting the regime's reliance on the West, involvement with Israel, economic issues, and political repression. The government responded with further repression, fueling more unrest. The Shah, weakened from cancer and concerned by the continued civil unrest, fled Iran in January of 1979. A month later, Khomeini returned to Iran, and the armed forces declared neutrality. This signaled the end of the Shah's regime. The country was declared an Islamic Republic on April 1, 1979. Khomeini became the new republic's supreme leader, consolidating power.
So the Iranian Revolution effectively proved two things. One, that student activism actually works, but it also was a sign to all of these other nations across the developing world that these, at face value, stable, US-backed, Soviet-backed regimes are actually quite fragile. So I would say that it removed the veneer of stability from the two major Cold War powers. And you see this cause ripple effects throughout the entire world. You see the Soviets invade Afghanistan in response. You see the seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. It's really hard to understate how consequential the Iranian Revolution was, not only for world politics, but in particular, the flow of oil throughout the world.
Cause I'm all alone. I need excitement, oh, I need it bad. And it's the best I've ever had.
Berlin remains the most compelling argument for an open world. Amir missed me.
The turmoil of the 1970s ushered in a new era of economics. By the 1980s, Keynesian interventionism was superseded by a new system, neoliberalism.
Neoliberalism, right? There was already a movement towards neoliberalism, deregulation, privatization, open borders for trade, mostly because the more interventionist models were exhausting themselves, right? Inflation was an issue, debt, and I think the oil crisis sort of accelerated all of that. And a lot of folks who were the ideological, intellectual, political forces behind bringing the markets back, as it were, took advantage of those crises to push their agenda forward, right?
The shift in focus from government-managed systems to systems managed by the private sector signaled a shift in power dynamics and control, both at home and abroad.
There is an argument that that's one form of making sure those countries remain aligned with the US, right? And so it's an alternative to political intervention.
Neoliberalism promised that open markets would replace the need for imperial force. What it could not account for was what happened when the nations being managed by those markets decided they had leverage of their own.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Right, so neoliberalism is essentially the idea that the government's only job is to make sure the economy is good. How's the economy good? No government intrusion. In fact, in this calculation, the only responsibility of the government is to protect private property, and that's it. So neoliberalism really defines all of the characteristics of the foreign interventions carried out by the United States in the aftermath of the Cold War. So if you look at the Gulf War, Somalia, Kosovo, Rwanda, the global war on terror. So if you look at all of these conflicts, though they're carried out in the name of human rights, really what's underlying the thinking in all of these premises is this the idea of liberating the economy from structural forces. You see this logic of the free markets defining every single one of those conflicts. I would argue that neoliberalism and its global spread is probably one of the most consequential phenomenon of the late 20th century and the defining feature of the 21st century. You can't understand the invasion of Ukraine. You can't understand the Iran war without understanding the impact that neoliberalism has had on shaping these ideas.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait. I've got to go. I have to go to work.
I got a little change in my pocket going jingle-lang-a-lang. Wants to call you on the telephone, baby. I give you a ring, but each time we talk, I get the same old thing.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Your hands to yourself.
In short, if President Milosevic will not make peace, we will limit his ability to make war.
We're here for a very clear purpose. And that purpose is to be part of an operation that is going to prevent the ethnic cleansing, the racial genocide, the appalling acts of evil brutality.
We're serving the troops because of what we know, not who we know.
Well, let me tell you about Halliburton, the company I ran. I'm very proud of what I did at Halliburton. The people of Halliburton are very proud of what they've accomplished, and I frankly don't feel any need to apologize for the way I've spent my time over the last 5 years as the CEO and chairman of a major American corporation.
Yeah, this is also an attempt to divert attention away from the fact they have no energy policy.
Started talking about true love, started talking about sin. I said, honey, I'll live with you for the rest of my life. She said, no hugging, no kissing.
On my orders,
coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
Keep your hands to yourself.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались. Мы готовы к любому развитию событий.
The Trump administration's rhetoric both echoes past justifications for intervention and reveals how control over choke points, especially the Strait of Hormuz, has become a modern mechanism that states like Iran can put pressure on and disrupt global flows of capital.
It seems to be very significant, right? The price of oil is going up, the stocks are going down. If we believe that our president likes to listen to investors, right, and pays attention to the stock market, that could be one of the things that is motivating him.
They never had to go through anything with respect to Congress.
Beginning February 28, 2026, the Trump administration, alongside Israel, launched a major military campaign against Iran, striking multiple military hubs and missile sites. This campaign, dubbed Operation Epic Fury, culminated in a decapitation strike, killing Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Subsequently, the IRGC closed the Strait of Hormuz, restricting vessel passage.
The strait is closed, so Iranian oil is not going out, Saudi oil is not going out, Qatari gas is not going out, helium is not going out, so all of those need to come from somewhere.
One of the interesting things about the current US-Israeli attack on Iran is that it's been carried out without even thinking about the security of flow of oil. And it makes all those earlier concerns about that this was really always about securing the flow of oil seem a little hollow.
This chain of events displays an imperative shift in the modern application of Mitchel's argument, a usurpation in the neo-imperialistic relationship between the West and the Global South. In recent months, the Iranian government has been subverting the recent trends surrounding oil that Mitchel described in the latter half of his book. Now, it appears that the Iranian state is attempting to utilize its control of the Strait of Hormuz in order to achieve its democratic ends, both domestically and abroad.
You shut down the Strait of Hormuz, you shut down the entry and exit to the Red Sea. The economy worldwide, it doesn't necessarily grind to a halt, but it's entirely affected.
Additionally, Iran has weaponized the Strait of Hormuz as a means of control in the Israeli invasion of Lebanon on March 16th. Iran has reopened the strait for commercial use, but promptly reclosed it following the beginning of Israeli incursion. This created tensions between Trump and Netanyahu, leading to the first communications between Beirut and Washington in 36 years, resulting in a ceasefire on April 16th. This again displays the ability of Iran to exercise its control of natural resources to achieve democratic political ends.
The difficulties of the alliance between the US and Israel today. The US has, clearly their interests have diverged since they launched this war, because the US is suddenly very, very concerned about the price of oil, about the possibility of a global recession, about the domestic political consequences in the US of this war that it suddenly finds it has no way out of. Israel is not looking for a way out of it, as far as I can tell. And so you see a real sort of divergence of purposes, and that is the divergence between the U.S. with its particular set of political and economic priorities and those of Israel, which include, of course, the project of Zionism.
Further, the Iranians have begun to show interest in disrupting Western hegemony by dismantling the U.S. petrodollar scheme. In the early stages of Operation Epic Fury, the Iranians began to charge tolls, priced in yen, for approved ships going through. Although there have yet to be any substantive developments in this realm, it opens the door to a possible course of action, using the foundation of the system to control it. Yet, this shift does not automatically restore earlier forms of democratic leverage. Energy has never been neutral. The technical properties of the fuel have always shaped the kinds of politics that are possible. The infrastructure that is built next will decide whether the coming era repeats the patterns of concentrated power or opens space for more egalitarian claims.
Some countries trying to transition to renewables sooner to try to compensate for that.
I think it's going to help accelerate the transition, partly because I think these high oil prices are not going to just disappear the moment a tanker or two comes through the Gulf. Damage to oil production facilities and just the kind of stickiness of these prices is going to last for, certainly through the current calendar year and beyond, even if prices do come down a little bit. And that, I think, is long enough to start seriously affecting decisions about renewables. And even if people can be confident that oil and particularly natural gas, which is sort of the other main competitor for renewables, even if they can be confident that the prices are going to gradually work their way down over the next 12 months, it's still a warning about the vulnerability to these kinds of actions if you stick with the natural gas and with oil. And in that sense, I think it's really going to hasten take up.
I'm here with Dr. Safa. Good evening, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Seth. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, and we're here to talk about carbon democracy and your expertise in the Middle East in terms of your knowledge of Turkish history.
Well, I've never been to Spain.
It's like POV, right?
But I kinda like the music. Say the ladies are insane there.
There's oil in
they
that
sure know how to use it. They don't abuse it.
Was there any particular bombshells that was revealing about carbon democracy, or any places that you kind of were confused about where the book was leading in general?
The part on the economy for a long time had me in a tailspin. I didn't know what he was talking about. And then I got to the end of it, and it kind of made a bit of sense at the end. So.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Hey there. Nice to meet you. Dr. Mitchell, we've been hearing a lot about your book.
But I've been to Oklahoma. People tell me I was
Slam.
The connection's a little shaky.
It's interesting to me that it kind of felt like I was on one grand conspiracy theory in the beginning.
For sure.
And then it actually started to make more sense about petrodollars and just how it all kind of connected together.
Yeah.
Well, I've never been to Spain, but
Do that again.